Today we have Lomax, Mads and myself, and we have a massively full docket. We're talking about Nobel Prizes, the DOJ breaking up Google. We're looking at UK borrowing costs, which are rising, pension funds and the UK government. Can they play nicely to invest in infrastructure? The Regulatory Innovation Office, what will that mean for UK regulation and innovation? Are LPs going to get back into VC in 2025? We're going to look at that. And then one of yours, Lomax, we're going to look at this startup ownership and location. We've had some big European Series Bs announced this week. Look at that. Now, that looks like everything on my lot. But before we start, Lomax, you are awesome. You are here. Tell us a little bit about you and where you are, what you're doing, what's cooking.
Thanks, guys. Great, delighted to be here. My name is Lomax. I'm the general partner and co-founder at Outside Ventures. We're a European-focused early-stage seed fund doing pre-seed and seed in deep tech. In Lisbon, I have 2 kids, and that's probably the most important thing that matters. And on the side of that, as you guys know, I run what some people call the greatest secret in European venture, a community and event retreat called Dragon Chasers, focused on and accelerating relations at the GPLP level in Europe.
Super duper. Yeah, and just to give you a little bit of a promo, massive Dragon Chasers fan, have been on all of them. And if you are an LP or a GP, get in touch with Lomax. It's an awesome thing. We do super cool stuff. Like we all get together and then we'll climb mountains or go on motorbike rides or visit Icelandic volcanoes. It's just super cool stuff. So well done. I think that's awesome.
Thank you, man. You're breaking the rule. There's no marketing on Dragon Chasers, but you are.
Well, there you go.
But you are our number one. You know, for the fancy dress night, I think you're on the podium every single time. So,
do you know what? The fancy dress stuff makes me feel super uncomfortable. I'm a massive introvert wrapped as an extrovert. It makes me feel super uncomfortable. But do you know what? If you're going to do it, you've got to go for it. So, but I just love the events. They're very cool. Now, we're going to kick off with one of yours on the docket, Lomax. Now, Nobel Prizes. Now, they've been given out this year for chemistry for the DeepMind founder Demis Hassabis, I hope I said his name right, and his colleague John Jumper. And also for Geoffrey Hinton and John Hopfield, who won in the physics category. So Demis and John were in the chemistry category, and Geoffrey and John in the physics category. But it looks like all Nobel Prizes could well be AI focused, because even though they're physics and chemistry, they're both actually around AI. Hassabis and Jumper created an AI model called AlphaFold, which I'm sure most people will know, that has predicted the structure of virtually all 200 million proteins that researchers have ever identified. Now, why is this important? Because this is all about medicines and vaccines, but there are a number of other humanity-driven focus areas around cleaning up plastic, pollution, all kinds of stuff. Now, AlphaFold was started in 20, and I think I'm right in saying AlphaFold 2 came out in 22. So these Nobel Prizes have taken a little bit of time to filter down. And Hinton, in the physics category, the godfather of AI, left Google last year to talk more freely about the downsides of AI. I don't want to ruin the mojo and the good stuff for the absolute incredible achievements here. But to start with, where are you both on the doomer scale? Mads, do you want to kick off?
Handled with care. I'm not on the doomer scale at all. I think it's super exciting. But like everything, we need to handle it with care, just like nuclear power, just like everything else that's powerful and potent, just like new, sophisticated drugs. We're not handing them out like candy for a reason. Just, be careful.
I'm totally with you.
Think about it.
But Max, where are you?
I fully agree.
Are you on the doomerish?
I think these are technologies that are so fundamental to this industrial revolution that we're going through at the moment, that we need to keep pressing on. But clearly, as Matt says, handle with care, and we don't want to stifle these things before they come to life. So I think we need to be very, very careful there with excessive regulation, which clearly us, the Europeans, are becoming somewhat infamous for. But we are, in an exciting time, and I think we need to keep pushing on, quite frankly. But yes,
no, I totally
all
agree.
of these fundamental technologies, they can always be used by bad actors.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Hong Kong currently, and I can't even use ChatGPT. So it's very interesting to see we're talking about the Europeans being heavy regulators. Being over here is a whole new mind-opening kettle of fish. Now, talking about regulation, another one of yours, Lomax, on the docket. So the Department of Justice in the US wants to break up Google. This has been discussed and ruminated a bunch of times. They specifically want to dismantle its search function away from the other parts of Alphabet to get more competition because 90% of all search goes through Google. Now, I'm thinking of this in two spaces. Now, I already use GPT or others, Perplexity or others to do my search, to run my search. I'm thinking, is this required? Will AI naturally break down some of the barriers in search to be discussed? And obviously in Europe, big tech is being fined every 10 seconds for some kind of antitrust practice. Now, your point, Lomax, was that as VCs, we always want to back monopolistic businesses, but where is the limit if there is one? So do you want to kick off? This is your driving force.
Yeah, I think first of all, you look at like a lot of what Peter Thiel says, the Founders Fund Manifesto, how we think. Like you do, when you look at companies that could be, billion dollar revenue companies as a seed investor, like they are kind of have the potential to be quasi monopolistic, right? I don't think we should shy away from that. There's a certain irony to this whole Google stuff now, which is that this has been Google have had 90% of search for years. And there's been rumblings always in the regulatory community to start cutting back and start holding them to account for that. But actually now is the time when probably they face more competition than ever and more likely to be eroded, given what's going on with ChatGPT, Perplexity, etc. So there is a somewhat kind of irony that the DOJ is finally getting to this. And by the way, this may not happen. They kicked a lot down the road. We still have the elections. I think if Trump gets in, it may just be buried. But there is definitely, ironically, this time where where they face the biggest risk to their business from the market, not from the regulators. So the regulators should just let the market sort it out. The only thing that I do potentially agree with the regulators is these deals that Google does to lock in the search function, as the primary go-to with third-party manufacturers. I think that needs to be looked at. But other than that, I'd let the market sort this out.
Yeah, I think if you look at how Apple run their Ask App Not to Track function, and then behind the scenes are tracking everything. There is this protectionism, which I think all companies are looking to create their moats. And where that oversteps the mark into something that then needs to be regulated at scale and size, I'm always intrigued by where that line is. But Mads, what's your take?
My take is that I think Lomax is bang on the money, that this is exactly the time when Google is the most vulnerable it has ever been due to new AI forces. And I would say if I am Sam Altman at OpenAI, or if I'm any one of the investors that have just backed his new $150 billion valuation round.
Yeah,
I'd hope exactly for
that.
Google to be, I'd hope exactly for Google to be broken up or threatened like they're being, because history does rhyme. You have kind of the late 70s and the early 80s with IBM facing severe antitrust scrutiny and being put under a lot of restrictions. That led them to taking the decisions they did around, being so careful not to be, being accused of monopolizing the PC market, that they invariably let the cat out of the bag and let Microsoft run away with it. Microsoft then repeating that in the noughties. They were being scrutinized. They completely lost sight of the game and lost on mobile. And so I think this is what could happen to Google here. I think Google is probably the only company that can really threaten OpenAI. Why? Because they have the richest data source on the planet. Outside of the internet, it's YouTube. And they have access to that data, and that means they can do things that probably no other company can do. But if they are broken up in this way, well, that's going to put all that to bed. And so I think then OpenAI will cruise to victory in the AI game. So actually, for that reason alone, it is probably important that we actually don't go in and break up Google at this time. I think we need competition. OpenAI is ahead in terms of commercializing AI technology. I think, Sam is, for all the noise, all the problems the company has had, I think he's just been running an incredible engineering shop, incredible product dev shop. Everybody that's following it and using the product, as we all are every day, can see just how fast it's evolving. And so it's important that we have competition there. And I think it would be a shame to sort of kill Google now and take that potential competitor out of the game. So yeah, this is the wrong move at the wrong time.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to the whole behemoths being felled. I remember when Facebook moved into the Sun Microsystems building or campus. It wasn't a building; it was a freaking campus. And just think how big Sun Micro was, and then to absolutely collapse. So it's just these things will, I think, naturally find a rhythm, but we'll see. And maybe they'll see it, and maybe they'll stop, or maybe there's too much inertia, and they're going to go for it. Now, coming back to the UK, Maz, this one is yours. We have an election
coming up, right? November 4th will determine all of this, I think.
I want to bring back to the UK. So UK borrowing costs are climbing, Mads. This is one of yours. Now, hopefully this won't be kind of trust level of crazy, unsustainable suggested borrowing, but the markets are obviously worried. What's going on? How will this, and obviously ultimately for us, how will this end up affecting startups and the UK venture scene? Mads, what do you think?
Well, to some extent, the chickens are coming home to roost now. The IFS has come out this morning and said that the UK will have to borrow an additional £25 billion a year to avoid cuts in real terms to the different departments, different services, different things we're doing, or make tax rises, right? Increase taxes to that same tune. The government has said, look, we really do not want to raise taxes. They're already quite high, and we don't think that's necessarily good for neither the citizens or business. So what you going to do? There's so many interesting vectors here. The obvious option has been taken off the table. The UK economy is a roughly £3 trillion beast. By all estimates, the cost of Brexit right now is about 4%. It will be about 4% by the end of the decade. That's just in very rough terms, around £100 billion. The tax from that could easily be 30 to 40 billion. And so if you have a gap of 25, well, you just Brexit reversal alone could solve it. When that's taken off the table, where do you go then? You've left this massive gap in the economy. And this is really the thing Rachel Reeves is trying to figure out. When we had the pod a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about foundations. We're talking about deregulating the economy and trying to boost growth. Some of the things that will have to happen for that to happen are just going to be incredibly hard. You have so many vested interests standing in the way. And given what we've seen from the government this far, I know they've said they won't be afraid to ruffle some feathers. I'm not sure they have the energy or really the courage to take on those vested interests. And so I worry that there'll be a bit of a fudge, and it'll be a combination of a little bit of tax rises here, maybe a little bit more on business, maybe a little bit on capital gains, maybe a little bit more borrowing, but not actually fixing some of the fundamental problems and doing some of the fundamental unlock we need. Now, that said, at the same time, one of the things that's really interesting is that the pension funds that are big investors in bonds that, will often say, these bond investors are the bond vigilantes. They're worried about kind of the government borrowing too much. They've actually come out and said, listen, you can borrow for sensible things. And we actually really want you to borrow to invest in infrastructure. Because what we would like to do is to work with government to fund all these big infrastructure projects that we need to make in energy, in transportation, etc. And so I think, a lot will come down to, are we going to make some sensible decisions around, actually investing in some of these areas and working with private investors, working with the pension funds to raise capital, so you have a kind of a private-public partnership that can unlock and drive in this investment. So I think there are opportunities here, but Rachel Reeves is balancing a very, very difficult set of equations right now, and I can imagine there are lots of late nights at the Treasury working through the spreadsheets.
That pension fund request feels like quite a sensible, quick decision to make. So their ability to change their definition of debt or to work out a way of co-investing with pension funds, because that'll bring in a whole lot of international investment as well. So it feels like that's quite a simple, smart, inoffensive thing to do. Where are the red lines in that, Mads? Why can't that happen?
No, so I think it can happen, but I think here is the risk. I think because it can happen, and I actually think it's probably not the hardest bit is not saying yes, we'll do it. The hardest bit is how do you make sure you get value for money in investments? We've talked about some of the infrastructure projects that cost so many hundred millions of pounds just in planning before any any screw, any brick, anything was put down. And that massively cuts the return on investment that you're going to get from that piece. And so you could say, well, the government can take up the slack. We can, taxpayers can fund that kind of that grind and fund these planning costs, et cetera, and then let private pension funds pick up the reward. But wouldn't it be great if we could do both at the same time? If we could say, look, let's go in and invest progressively in infrastructure, and let's also try and reform some of these barriers that stand in the way, so we can build and develop, in a more cost-effective way. Then you get the double benefit, and then actually I think you can find a way out of this fiscal hole we're finding ourselves in.
So so it's not as simple as changing that rule set. It's actually more about how that then lends itself in the infrastructure way into planning another channel. Okay, maybe it's not as simple as before. Sorry, Lomax, I interrupted you. Where were you going to go?
I was going to say, the UK has just suffered from a chronic lack of investment in infrastructure in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah,
right?
for decades.
So I think, and I think Rachel Reeves acknowledges that. She's probably been somewhat hampered by getting in and finding this quote unquote, 22 billion black hole, which has made her kind of course correct a bit. I mean, I do think that going back to the borrowing cost point, this budget, which is going to be 30th October, is now 4 months after the election. I think I listened somewhere, I read somewhere that it was the longest distance between an election and a first budget. And actually, I think that uncertainty has been really, really unhelpful for everyone, quite frankly, like the investors, and everyone in the business community and just everyone in the country, quite frankly. So I think that she needs to get on with it. And the longer the uncertainty continues, the more the speculation continues, the more that, you have collateral damage, like, the borrowing costs going up. So I think it's high time that we get that done. I mean, it's only now 2 weeks away, 3 weeks away, actually, still. But we need to get on with it, quite frankly. But I agree with Mads, we need the investment. The pension funds, ironically, I want to say ironically, like, there's a little bit of bias in the pension funds that have come and said this. You've got IFM, right? I mean, they're one of the biggest infrastructure owners in the UK, right? So it's like they're kind of they're not just talking their own book, but they're arguing for a position that is very favourable to them. But actually, it's consistent with what we believe anyway in terms of unlocking a whole bunch of infrastructure investment that's badly needed in the country.
Sounds super aligned. I think there's always a challenge when a Labour government comes in as to how much they're going to borrow and how much they're going to spend. So you're right, that uncertainty gap has been too long.
Exactly. If you look at when Labour came in, everyone, say New Labour came in with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, everyone was obsessed with the markets just completely reacting very negatively to that. And the first thing that Gordon Brown did very sensibly was give the Bank of England its independence to kind of take it away from the government, and that kind of settled markets. But that was all done extremely quickly. This has actually just been done it's just too slow, quite frankly. And then they've had all this stuff.
And they've been miserable along the way, right? They've just been, her and Starmer have just been these miseries. Oh, it's going to be a tough, budget. It's going to be a tough year. It's like, oh my goodness, at least put some positivity in the pot as well.
Yeah, and then they've allowed, I guess in a way, the lack of clear policy from them and the lack of direction on all of this has actually allowed the right-wing press to fill it with all of this like expenses and, free ticket stuff, which is a bit of a sideshow. If you look at Boris Johnson, the guy was, flying around the world and decorating his flat with tens, hundreds of thousands of donations and gifts. But they've let that, and it's a bit of an own goal, I'm afraid.
See what happens in a few weeks. I mean, I want to stay with the UK government. I saw this week they've launched the Regulatory Innovation Office, which sounds like a very juxtaposed title, aimed at helping speed up approvals for new technologies in fields such as biotech, space, autonomous vehicles. Now, this is obviously coming out of the EU. We needed a department to manage our approvals frameworks, and it looks like they're trying to do it more quickly. They're trying to get from innovation through to approval more quickly, and without that perhaps that European overhang, maybe that's even possible. So it sounds good, but what will this really, really mean, do we think? Mads, do you want to kick off?
It may be too early to say. I think the intentions are good. We know what we say about the road to hell and what it's paved with. What we need in a lot of places is deregulation. So that's step one. Will that be part of the remit? And if not, where will that happen? Because that's super, super important. There are places where we do need streamlined regulation and streamlined approvals. I would say the FCA has had some success with the sandbox and some of the other initiatives they've taken. But we also know that, in general, kind of FCA regulation in the UK is just way overkill. And it's slowing down the market. It's slowing down the financial system. It's creating kind of a shadow banking system, right? So much of the credit activity that used to be on banking balance sheets are now in private credit and all kinds of other places where you can't really see it. What will happen here, and will it be kind of a regulatory behemoth, or will it lead to lots of new rules, or will it lead to something that is truly streamlined and sensible? I just don't know that we know yet. But the intentions are there and are probably right.
Now, Lomax, you've swerved a lot of this. You're down in Lisbon, so I don't know how much you stay in track with UK government pushes.
It's highly relevant given we deploy about a third to half our money in the UK. We have in our portfolio a bunch of tech bio companies. We have new food companies, cultured meat companies. So this is very, very relevant. That's one of the kind of areas that this regulator has been tasked with streamlining things. I mean, there's a sort of who guards the guards moment about this was the first thing I thought was just, talking about irony is, how do we cut excessive regulation? We create a new regulatory body. It seems, I think, Mads mentioned earlier in another context, like things becoming a fudge, like there is a risk that this also becomes a fudge. It really needs like the political and the financial backing, not just for the next 6 months, but for the next 3, 4, 5 years, for the life of this government, and ideally for the life of, if they win the next election. So for me, I think the intention is great. It's an acknowledgement that there is excessive regulation for some of these startups in these new areas that are extremely important, and that the FCA sandbox is a good case study to try and recreate that. But I'm always a bit skeptical about, let's just create a regulatory or oversight body, because look at all of the regulatory bodies in the UK, like take water, for example, they're completely stretched. Take the Information Commission. They have, or the ICO, they don't have the ability to process stuff. They're underwhelmed because they're just underfunded. And this could if this becomes yet another underfunded, government body, then it's a waste of time.
Yeah, then what the heck? Well, let's stay on investing. So the title, this was my one on the docket. The title being, will LPs get back into VC in 25? So will LPs start investing in GPs as we are? Venture Capital Journal has launched this year's poll, which I think is happening between now and November, testing LP appetite for investing in venture capital. Now, the title of the email was, are LPs still grumpy about VC, which I thought was not a particularly useful framing. But let's have a look at some of the highlights from last year's report, which was taken in November 2023, where LPs expected half of their portfolio to meet expectations. It was pretty standard. It was only in 21, 22, it looks like that there was an expectation of higher performance. The number of LPs avoiding first-time managers doubled last year before their expectations for this year to 42%. Nearly a quarter said they were over-allocated to VC, but it was only up 15%, but they were feeling, a little bit left out, hung out to dry. The proportion of LPs looking to add new VCs dropped to 30%, which was the lowest number ever. Late stage and growth became the least popular strategy, but not by a whole bunch, I think by about 5-6%. And the biggest challenge for LPs, which I'm not sure was just a last year challenge, was access to tier one funds and then how to pick from the rest, so a choice challenge. Now, when you look at the data, for context, this is a global report, but when you look at it, the largest proportion of respondents by a large margin were insurance companies, fund of funds, and pension funds. So the results are obviously skewed in their direction. And we also suffer with the aggregation problem, because I'm sure there are territory and sector and other divides in there. Now, Lomax, we'll start with you, because you work, obviously, with Dragon Chasers. You work with a whole bunch of LPs, not only as a fund manager, but also via DC. Is there a renewed appetite, do you think, for LPs to invest in venture across Europe or not?
Really interesting question. I mean, I'm not fundraising at the moment. I will be next year. But anecdotally, all of our peers in Dragon Chasers and beyond, like it's tough work out there. Pulling in LP commitments at the moment. I would say I see brighter sparks now. Like some really interesting. I was chatting to the more touristy type new entrants to the market that came in 21, 22 at the LP level they're not back. and they're not coming back for a long time.
That was a big chunk. People forget that if you look at some of the numbers, up to 70% of that capital was not venture capital as we know it. So just to give a little bit of context of that massive
and by the way, the slight problem with that is a lot of the emerging managers, so funds 1, 2, 3, because the people you just said who filled out that survey, they're not really backing emerging managers. Some of them are, but not many of them are. It's a very, very small proportion. By emerging managers, I generally mean funds 1, 2, 3. So a lot of that kind of tourist money, which actually became a bit of a lifeblood well, I mean, you guys are an emerging manager too, for us, is gone. So I think for the people raising funds 1, 2, 3, you're having to work that bit extra harder. Funnily enough, though, I've actually had conversations with a few family offices in the last month. But these are sophisticated, smart family offices who invest for the long term and are actually building, are looking actively seeking new managers, right? Which is really interesting because I wasn't having those conversations last year. So I think for people who are in this game for another 10, 20, 30 years and have that horizon, there's interesting pockets of capital. And I think there's a theme going on that a lot of those funds that used to write, 20, 30, 40, 50 mil checks into the more established funds are starting to run emerging manager programs. And I can see that. It just takes time to develop. At the same time, if you look at the established funds, Tomoco, Bodelson, I think you probably talked about their fundraisers, recently. There's sort of appetite for those kind of funds because, you don't get fired for backing them. And if you've got a VC allocation that's been agreed 18 months before, I mean, they're great funds, I'm sure, but, they've raised a lot of money in the face of what we've seen at the emerging manager level, which has been much, much harder.
Yeah, we've seen a bit of the European mega funds fundraising big funds, which I think is great. I'm in Hong Kong now at an event meeting some investors, and there is a much different conversation happening now than there was at the beginning of the year. It feels anecdotally more open. How that transpires, we will see. But just to put into context, their allocation of all of the people that I meet, their total allocation is 1, 2, 3, 5% into alternatives, of which that mainly means, US tier ones if they can get in. So there is, of their allocation, of their entire strategy, it's a tiny, tiny proportion that goes into alternatives, which is such an odd, I've never understood that word. It's such a weird thing, but we are part of that alternatives bucket, VC. But Mads, what's your take? You've done you've hit some of these event circuits. Right? Do you think there's more appetite for venture?
I think, all investing is cyclical and most investors chase past returns. And so, we saw a huge bubble going back, 3, 4, 5 years, and everybody was piling into VC, and then there's a bit of an overhang. And of course, investing when everybody else is investing is generally the wrong thing to do in these types of asset classes because it just means everything gets bid up and returns, they suffer. And then I think you've had a couple of bad years because of that. And then folks, they take a step away. And now is, of course, exactly the time to come in. But some folks are still burned and therefore are sitting on the sidelines. I think it's entirely natural. It's human psychology. And I think to some extent it's on us as managers to make the case and explain to prospective investors why now is the time to invest and why there's some great opportunities. So I can't say there's much that surprises me in any of this.
I was speaking to
one thing I've always found. Oh, sorry, Dan. Yeah.
No, there's a bit of a time delay. No, you go, Lomax. I'll shout in a second.
No, I was going to say one thing I've always found funny is for the emerging manager segment, funds 1, 2, 3. In the good times, the narrative is the LPs are being forced to re-up so quickly and so often in the established funds, which are raising more quickly, so they don't have time for you. And then in the bad times, they want to go to the big names and stay away from the risky little names. So in a way, there's not a market that actually really suits the emerging manager.
It's a lose-lose.
It's a lose-lose.
The flip side of that, I was speaking with a very very experienced fund allocator the other day. He's made dozens and dozens of LP commitments into venture funds, and he said, listen, the real secret here is that so many of the big firms that were gorging on money and making investments every 2 seconds a few years ago are sitting on these massive portfolios today. They're full of shit, and they're spending all their time managing that stuff, and they don't have time to look at the new opportunities. So if anything, this is the perfect time to back new managers because they don't have all that legacy they're carrying around. So his view is now is definitely time to back the new guys. So just for what it's worth.
It's a really good point. Like when in venture, because of the long timelines of the investments, you every deal you do can easily become a massive burden, and then as you say, it constrains your ability to do new things.
Yeah.
I was Mads and I have been speaking about how if you look at VC on aggregate, it's a very, very lucrative asset class, but it's just a hyper risky one. And I was speaking to a private banker here, and I was saying, why didn't you just set up an emerging manager index? Why didn't you just invest in all of us? And then you're gonna probably do pretty well. And he didn't say no, so we'll see where that goes. Last but not least, this is another one for you, Lomax. Now, we're talking about ownership and location, and what does that matter? So you threw into the docket 3 big European Series Bs that were announced. So we've got Dextry, Poolside, and Nucleo. But are they European? When I was looking at who they are, where they are, what they're doing. So Dextry was UK, but now also has a US HQ after raising 80 million. Poolside with its now approximate 3 billion valuation after raising another 500 million, and it has never released a product. It's the dev tooling. It's never released a product. Famously moved from the US to France, which is counterintuitive to everybody. But it didn't really, if you read between the lines, it doesn't look like a clean out of the US and into France. And Nucleo is now relocating from London to Paris after securing just over half €500 million. Now, the question to you both is, as Europeans, are we too sensitive to ownership and location? What really, really matters? Lomax, do you want to kick off?
I think I look to the substance here when I look at these investments, right? When I look at these deals, let's say, as like an indicator of what's going on. And I'd say this cheers me up because for European, companies of European origin, and by the way, Dextry is a fully European project, right? They're out of Romania, UK, like 100% European. Nucleo is 100% European, founded by probably one of the most successful founders in Europe no one's ever heard of, right? Because it's in life sciences. And Poolside, the CTO is actually lives down the road from me, right? So probably a deal that I missed. The substance of these companies, they show a couple of interesting things to me. One is we have the talent and ability.
Yes.
They're examples of the talent, going through and actually building commercially viable entities that can actually raise meaningful capital. Because all 3 of these are deep tech companies. I invest in deep tech at seed. I actually been a bit depressed in the last 2 years around the lack of capital at Series A and Series B for deep tech companies, right? So for me, this makes me really, really excited. In terms of you look at UiPath, Romanian company, ended up having a US holdco and raising, IPOing in New York. I think in this day and age, I think we don't need to overthink it. The point is, for me, I see these kind of European talent pools kind of growing and actually raising money and building businesses, and that excites me. The Nucleo one is a funny one, and actually it really speaks against the UK, which is that he founded that business in the UK. So that's a nuclear, a new nuclear
it's London-based startup, wasn't it?
London-based, and an Italian entrepreneur built and sold his nuclear medicine company for $4 billion to Novartis, right? Owned 10% of it still, is not sitting on a yacht, is actually reinvesting that. This guy's an absolute, one of the real kind of hidden champion entrepreneurs in Europe. But he's actually taken his company away from the UK into Europe, and I don't know what the inside story is, but I suspect it's around funding. I suspect he's getting a lot of money from French government, Italian government putting some money in.
My assumption was that it was about the nuclear connection.
Oh, that might be true.
There was more of a French nuclear piece that was the connective tissue.
Well, there might be that, but I would also suspect there's a little bit of fun. But that, in a way, is that's a European micro story. It's within Europe, and it's if you're going to get more money from one government, then maybe it makes sense to leave that. But it's really sad for the UK that we're not able to retain that kind of company and have it built in the UK. If companies want to go and incorporate in the US and tap into the capital markets there, whether private or public, I'm afraid that's just it's 4, 5, 6 times the amount of money there. You just have to do it. But we're seed investors. Dextry was a European seed round. Poolside was hybrid. There's 0.9 and Air Street, a bunch of European funds in there, and the guys out of Paris, Xavier Niel. So I think that bodes really, really well for me. And I don't get too lost in these companies that ultimately become like transatlantic, tech companies. And if they need to go to the US to commercialize and raise money, then so be it, which actually, to be honest, most of our companies end up doing that.
I get a little bit sad when that happens. I get a little bit down on the whole, because you're right. You have to kind of follow the money and you have to follow the market. But it's a shame when we're not really feeding European pockets. Anyway, Matt, sorry I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, sorry. I was just going to say. I mean, with nuclear, don't you think if the UK had been as serious about nuclear power as the French are, that they would have stayed?
That's what I mean. So I think I agree.
That's the output of decisions that were made decades ago that we just have not been investing in the French have. So that's a natural place for a nuclear power startup to settle itself.
Well, that's true. But if you're UK government now that is now have this whole narrative around investment, right? Actually, those are the kind of companies that investment and decarbonisation of the energy markets. These are the kind of big decisions that you would actually want to see, and at least retaining a strong element of the company in the UK.
I agree. I just think the French went whole hog on nuclear in the 70s. We've been flip-flopping for decades. I mean, I think if we want to be serious, it'll take a few years to spin that back up. You've got to be a little bit strategic. It's what I'm trying to say is you can dangle a bit of dollars or a bit of pounds or euros. That's very short term. But if you really want to be serious about this stuff, you've got to take a longer view.
Yeah, that's true. Although, I guess in a way, why was he setting up in the UK in the first place? There must have been a reason for that. But yeah, I get it. But I think big picture good. We don't, guys. This is the big problem, and it, right? We do not have the Series B, also Series A capital for European deep tech companies. It doesn't exist. And especially in this market. So I'm afraid I can get depressed about it, and I can look at the Draghi report and be like, oh, great, we're going to try and make European more dynamic again. But that's going to take years, and it's the rules of the game we play, guys. And I think we have the benefit of being the seed investors who can actually get exposure to that and give our LPs, right, which includes US, European governments and pension funds and, family offices, some actually like amazing investment opportunities, right? If you got in the seed round of these companies, you're sitting on huge markups and maybe able to secondary them in this market potentially.
No, I don't think it's just deep tech that's struggling with growth. It looks like there is a growth gap, across the European spectrum. Mads, anything finally from you before we sign off?
Yeah, I mean, just before we go, all doom and gloom. So this year, I think two of the first $1 billion European VC raises, right? Both Balderton and Atomico have sort of broken that barrier, and they're up there now, sort of with Index. I think it's very easy to go very negative. I actually think things are still moving in the right direction. Would I want to go faster? Absolutely. Are we all pulling hard? Lomax, I know you and your team is, and we push hard every day to try and advance things. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think the thing that can be a bit disheartening to all of us, I guess, is when we see some of these things that should be, obvious decisions not being made because of political expediency or populism, or just like folks not just having the courage to do the right thing. And then you end up with kind of suffering the consequences and not reaping the economic growth years down the line. That could be a bit frustrating. But I would say overall, I think, European venture is still a success story, and it's growing, and there's, a lot of good things are happening, and it gets better, I would say, every day and every year.
I think if you look at what we do day to day on the ground, the quality of founders and projects that we're seeing is definitely going up and to the right. So that gives you, on a 10, 20-year lens, hope, and serious hope, quite frankly. So I think that's a great note to end on.
I'm game for that. And in the meantime, if we have to ship to the States or elsewhere, then so be it. But hopefully that will turn around within my lifetime. Let's go with that. I am an old fart. But thank you, gentlemen. You rock my world. I will catch you very, very soon.